Her name was Isabella, and she was drowning. Drowning in student debt, drowning in the scent of truffle oil and seared scallops, drowning in the polite, empty smiles she wore like a uniform. For 8 hours a night, she wasn't an art history scholar with a near photographic memory. She was just a waitress. But one rainy Tuesday evening, a simple act of kindness spoken in a language she learned for dusty textbooks caught the ear of the one man who could either save her or destroy her. What he left on his table wasn't just a tip. It was an enigma wrapped in a first-class ticket to a life she couldn't possibly imagine, a life where her deepest knowledge would become her only weapon. The Gilded Sparrow wasn't just a restaurant, it was a theatre. Located on a quiet, cobblestoned street in Soho, it was a meticulously crafted stage where New York's elite performed the nightly ritual of being seen. The lighting was always dimmed to a conspiratorial twilight, making diamonds sparkle and hiding the faint lines of worry on the faces of investment bankers. The air hummed with a carefully curated symphony, the gentle clinking of baccarat crystal, the hushed murmur of billion-dollar deals, and the distant rhythmic sizzle from the kitchen of celebrity chef Antoine Dubois, a man who had never actually cooked a meal there in 5 years. Isabella Rossi moved through this theatre like a ghost in a black apron. To the patrons, she was a pair of hands delivering a plate of pan-seared foie gras, refilling a glass of Chateau Margaux, silently clearing away the remnants of their opulence. They never saw the exhaustion clouding her deep brown eyes, or the slight tremble in her hands at the end of a double shift. They never saw the young woman who spent her pre-dawn hours hunched over textbooks, poring over the brushstrokes of Fragonard and the dramatic chiaroscuro of Caravaggio, dreaming of a life surrounded by canvas and history instead of linen and silver. Her reality was a fifth-floor walk-up in Brooklyn, a stack of overdue bills held together by a fraying rubber band and the ever-present gnawing anxiety of her mother's mounting medical expenses back in Ohio. Her master's degree in art history, specializing in 18th century French portraiture, felt less like an achievement and more like a cruel joke, an expensive key to a door that remained stubbornly locked. So she served. She smiled. She recited the specials with a polished grace that belied the fact she often skipped meals to make rent. Tonight was particularly brutal. A storm had broken over the city, and every table was filled with diners lingering over dessert, unwilling to brave the deluge. Isabella's feet throbbed a dull, persistent ache that radiated up her spine. She was on autopilot, her mind a million miles away, somewhere in the hallowed halls of the Musée d'Orsay, when the hostess seated the woman at table 7. The woman was old, impeccably dressed in a Chanel suit that was likely older than Isabella herself, with a string of pearls resting on her wrinkled neck. She carried an air of formidable old-world wealth, but her eyes darting around the room held a flicker of panicked confusion. She was Geneviève Dubois, the 80-year-old mother of the restaurant's famous and famously absent owner. She spoke to the hostess in a rapid, agitated torrent of French, her hands gesturing wildly. The young hostess, a summer hire named Madison, just stared back with a deer-in-the-headlights expression, offering a helpless, "I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't understand." Isabella watched as the situation escalated. Mrs. Dubois' voice grew louder, her distress mounting. Other diners were beginning to stare. The manager, a perpetually stressed man named Robert, was on the other side of the room, placating a hedge fund manager who thought his steak was medium rare instead of the divinely inspired medium rare he had ordered. This was it. One of those moments that could curdle an entire evening. Isabella took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and approached the table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm and low. She first addressed Madison. "I can handle this." Then she turned to the elderly woman, her posture shifting from weary waitress to composed professional. She switched languages, her French flowing not with the stilted precision of a classroom, but with the gentle, nuanced cadence she'd perfected by listening to countless hours of historical recordings for her dissertation. She didn't ask what was wrong. Instead, in fluent French, she introduced herself and complimented the woman's elegant brooch. She spoke of the rain, how it made the city lights look like scattered jewels. She calmed the storm before she addressed the cause. Slowly, Mrs. Dubois' tense shoulders relaxed. Her frantic gestures ceased. She looked at Isabella, truly looked at her for the first time. The problem, it turned out, was simple. Mrs. Dubois had lost her driver. Her phone was dead. She was supposed to be meeting her son, who was, of course, nowhere to be found. She was alone, confused, and felt invisible in a city that roared with a language she couldn't grasp. Isabella listened patiently. She assured her everything would be all right. She explained in that same soothing French that she would arrange for the restaurant's car service to take her home, that they could charge her phone behind the bar, and that she would personally call her son's assistant to inform them of the change of plans. She took the woman's coat, seated her comfortably, and brought her a cup of chamomile tea, all while maintaining a quiet, reassuring conversation. She was so focused on Mrs. Dubois that she barely noticed the man at the adjacent table, table 8. He had been there for over an hour, sitting alone in the corner booth, a solitary figure, nursing a single glass of Macallan 25. He hadn't looked at a menu. He hadn't touched the bread basket. He had simply watched the room with an unnerving stillness, his gaze sharp and intelligent. His suit was dark, bespoke, and understated, the kind of expensive that whispered rather than shouted. He was neither old nor young, with strands of silver at his temples that contrasted with his dark hair. There was a profound sadness in his eyes, a weight that seemed at odds with his powerful stillness. He watched Isabella's entire interaction with Mrs. Dubois. He saw the shift from tired server to confident caretaker. He heard the flawless Parisian accent. He saw the genuine empathy in her expression, the gentle way she touched the elderly woman's arm to reassure her. He saw something more than a waitress performing her job. When Isabella finally returned to her duties, her heart still beating a little faster from the adrenaline she passed table 8, the man caught her eye for a fraction of a second. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of thanks or a flirtatious advance. It was a look of acknowledgement, of appraisal. An hour later, as the restaurant began to empty, Isabella went to clear table 8. The man was gone. The glass of scotch was empty. Beside it, tucked neatly under a heavy black credit card, was not a typical tip. It was a crisp stack of $100 bills, far more than the cost of the drink, and beneath the money lay a single folded piece of heavy cream-colored cardstock. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Her first thought was that he'd forgotten it. She picked it up. It wasn't a business card. It was a note, handwritten in bold black ink. The penmanship was strong, decisive. It read, "Your kindness is a rare currency. Your fluency is a rarer skill. I have a proposition that requires both. A car will be waiting for you at this address tomorrow at 9 a.m. Be in it." Below the address, a private airfield in Teterboro, New Jersey, was a phone number and a name, Donovan Sterling. Tucked inside the folded note was something else. It was thin, rectangular, and printed on official-looking paper. It was an open-ended first-class ticket on a private jet. The destination field was blank. Isabella stood there amidst the debris of other people's lavish meals, her entire world tilting on its axis. The sounds of the restaurant faded into a dull roar. The throbbing in her feet was gone, replaced by a frantic, terrifying pulse in her ears. This was impossible. It was a joke, a very, very elaborate prank, or something far more sinister. People like her girls whose smell of floor polish and borrowed perfume didn't get notes from men named Donovan Sterling. They didn't get handed tickets to nowhere. She looked at the note again, her fingers trembling. A proposition that requires both kindness and fluency. The two things she had offered so freely to a lost old woman, never imagining they were being audited by a silent stranger in the corner. The back of house at the Gilded Sparrow was a world away from the dining room's velvet and mahogany opulence. It was a cramped, chaotic space of stainless steel, harsh fluorescent lights, and the lingering smell of garlic and bleach. The air was thick with steam and tension. Here smiles were shed like dirty aprons. Isabella stumbled into the staff break room, a glorified closet with a wobbly table and two mismatched chairs, her mind reeling. She sank onto one of the chairs, the heavy cardstock of the note feeling unnaturally warm in her hand. The stack of $100 bills sat on the table looking obscene next to a half-eaten bag of chips. Her friend and fellow waitress Chloe walked in, untying her apron with a groan. Chloe was a pragmatist, a born and bred New Yorker with a sharp tongue and an even sharper sense of self-preservation. She'd seen it all and believed in none of it. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Chloe said, grabbing a bottle of water from the mini-fridge. "Let me guess. Table 12 complained about the sommelier's attitude again. I swear that guy thinks he's the Pope of Pinot Noir." Isabella just stared at the note, unable to form a coherent sentence. She pushed it across the table towards Chloe, along with the jet ticket. Chloe picked it up, her brow furrowing. She read the note, then read it again. She let out a low whistle. Donovan Sterling. The Donovan Sterling. "You know him?" Isabella asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Know him, Izzy, everyone knows him. He's like a myth. Sterling Global Holdings. He owns shipping lanes, tech startups, half of the real estate in Hudson Yards. The guy breathes money. He's also a total recluse, especially since his wife died a few years ago. You never see him at these kinds of places. What did you do?" "Nothing, I helped Mrs. Dubois, the old woman at table 7. He was at table 8. He just sat there all night watching." Chloe examined the ticket, holding it up to the light, as if to check for a watermark. Teterboro. An open-ended ticket. This is either the start of a fairy tale or a horror movie, and I'm really not sure which. She looked at Isabella, her usual cynicism softening with genuine concern. "Are you seriously considering this? I don't know what to think," Isabella confessed, running a hand through her hair. "It can't be real. It's a mistake, or a test, or worse." The dark alleys of her imagination offered up a dozen terrifying scenarios, from human trafficking to elaborate scams. "Or," Chloe said, tapping the note, "it's exactly what it looks like. A rich, eccentric billionaire was impressed by the classy French-speaking girl who was kind to an old lady, and he's decided to make you his personal Eliza Doolittle. Stranger things have happened." She paused, her expression turning serious. "Look, Izzy, be smart about this. Guys like that don't operate in the same universe we do. Their propositions can have clauses you don't see until it's too late." The subway ride home was a blur. The familiar screech of the train's wheels and the crush of late-night commuters felt alien, like she was watching it all through a pane of thick glass. Back in her small apartment, the note and ticket sat on her worn-out IKEA coffee table, a portal to another world. The stack of cash was tucked away in a drawer, feeling like evidence of a crime she hadn't yet committed. Sleep was impossible. Her mind was a whirlwind of what-ifs. What if she went? What if she didn't? The life she was living stretched out before her, a long, monotonous road of double shifts, mounting debt and deferred dreams. Her dissertation was half finished. Her research stalled for lack of funding to travel to the archives in France. Her mother's calls were becoming more frequent. her cheerful tone barely masking the worry about her upcoming surgery and how they would possibly afford it. This note, this insane, impossible note, felt like a lightning strike on that long grey road. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also the first flicker of something other than despair she had felt in years. With trembling fingers, she opened her laptop. The screen cast a pale blue light across her face as she typed Donovan Sterling into the search bar. The results were a strange mix of immense public influence and intense personal privacy. There were dozens of articles from Forbes and the Wall Street Journal detailing the colossal acquisitions and market-shaking moves of Sterling Global Holdings. He was a titan of industry, a visionary in logistics and renewable energy. There were photos of him at charity galas from years ago, always impeccably dressed with a reserved, almost melancholy smile. Then she found the articles about his wife, Helene Sterling. She had been French, a former ballerina from a prominent Parisian family. She was beautiful, elegant, and by all accounts the vibrant center of Donovan's world. And she had died, suddenly, tragically, in a boating accident 3 years ago. After her death, Donovan Sterling had all but vanished from public life. He still ran his empire, but from the shadows. The few candid photos that existed showed a man haunted by a profound loss. Isabella stared at a picture of Hélène. She was stunning with dark, intelligent eyes and a graceful posture that spoke of her ballet training. Isabella then found an article that quoted Hélène, an interview from a fundraiser for the arts. In it, she talked about her passion for 18th century art, her love for the delicate works of Jean-Honoré Fragonard. A chill ran down Isabella's spine. It was her exact area of academic specialization. This couldn't be a coincidence. But what did it mean? Did he run background checks on waitresses? Did he somehow know about her studies? It seemed paranoid insane. And yet, the pieces fit together with a chilling, inexplicable logic. His late French wife loved the specific school of art that Isabella was an expert in. The language, the kindness, the art. It was a trifecta of circumstance, so perfect it felt engineered. She thought about the look in his eyes at the restaurant. It wasn't predatory. It wasn't romantic. It was assessing, like a connoisseur examining a painting, looking past the surface for its hidden provenance, its true value. He hadn't just seen a waitress. He had seen something in her that for some reason he needed. Her fear began to recede, replaced by a surge of consuming curiosity. This was no longer just about money or a potential job. It was a mystery, and for the first time, Isabella felt like more than a victim of her circumstances. She felt like a protagonist. She looked around her tiny apartment. The peeling paint, the stack of art books. She couldn't afford the single wilting rose in a glass on her windowsill. This was her life. Safe, predictable, and suffocating. Then she looked at the note. It represented the unknown. It was a terrifying, reckless leap into a void. But it was also a chance to be someone else. Someone whose knowledge was valued, whose skills were sought after. Someone who didn't have to choose between her passion and her family's well-being. At 4 a.m., as the first grey light of dawn began to creep over the Brooklyn skyline, she made her decision. She picked up her phone, not to call the number on the card, but to call her mother. She needed to hear her voice before she stepped off the edge of the world. "You're going to what?" Her mother's voice, usually a warm and steady comfort, was sharp with alarm on the other end of the line. It was 6 a.m. in Ohio, and Isabella's call had clearly woken her. "I'm going to take a trip, Mum, for a potential job opportunity," Isabella said, trying to keep her own voice, even editing the story, into something a worried mother could digest. She mentioned a generous patron, a networking opportunity, a short consulting gig. She left out the private jet, the blank destination, and the mysterious, grieving billionaire. "Isabella, honey, this doesn't sound like you. You're always so careful. Who is this person?" "He's a respected businessman." "Mom, I looked him up. It's all legitimate." She lied, or at least stretched the truth into a shape she could handle. "It's a long shot, but it could change things. For us." There was a long pause on the line. Isabella could hear the unspoken fears, the lifetime of warnings about a world that was not kind to young women with more dreams than money. But her mother also knew the weight her daughter carried. She knew about the crushing debt, the abandoned dissertation, the light that had slowly been dimming in Isabella's eyes. "All right," her mother said, finally, her voice soft again. "You're a smart girl, Isabella. You have a good head on your shoulders and a good heart. Trust your instincts. If it feels wrong, you walk away, no questions asked. You call me the second you land, wherever you are. Promise me." "I promise," Isabella said, a lump forming in her throat. The simple act of her mother's trust was both a comfort and a terrifying burden. After the call, a strange sense of calm settled over her. The decision was made. The gears of an unknown machine were already turning. She packed a small overnight bag, her movements deliberate and focused. What does one pack for a meeting with a billionaire on an unknown continent? She chose her one good suit, a simple, well-tailored navy blazer and matching trousers, a few blouses, and her worn copy of The Rococo Boudoir. She tucked her dissertation notes into her bag, a talisman from a life she was either leaving behind or finally about to claim. At 8:30 a.m., she took one last look at her apartment, a silent farewell to the girl who had woken up here yesterday. Then she walked down the 5 flights of stairs and out into the morning light, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The final test of her resolve was calling the number on the note. She dialed it on the curb, her hands shaking so badly she had to try twice. It rang only once. A voice answered, crisp and devoid of any warmth. Yes. It wasn't a question. It was a command. "Hello, my name is Isabella Rossi. I was given this number by Mr. Sterling last night." "We are aware," the voice said. "The car is 5 minutes from your location. A black Lincoln Town car. The driver's name is Arthur. He will not speak to you. Do not be late." The line went dead. No name, no greeting, no confirmation. Just cold, efficient instructions. This was the world she was stepping into. It was chilling. The black car arrived at 8:55 a.m., gliding to the curb with an unnerving silence. The tinted windows were opaque, reflecting Isabella's own wide-eyed, anxious face. The driver, a large man in a black suit, got out and opened the rear door for her without a word, just as the voice had predicted. The interior was a cocoon of plush black leather and polished wood, smelling faintly of citrus and money. The silence inside was absolute, shutting out the raucous symphony of the city completely. The drive to Teterboro Airport in New Jersey was surreal. Isabella watched the familiar landscape of her life, the bodegas, the brown stones, the chaotic traffic recede through the tinted glass. It felt like watching a movie of someone else's past. The airport wasn't the commercial chaos of JFK or LaGuardia. It was a different universe entirely. They bypassed terminals and security lines, driving directly onto the tarmac, where a sleek, impossibly white Gulfstream G850ER sat waiting its engines, humming a low, powerful thrum. It had a single discreet silver S logo on its tail. As Isabella stepped out of the car, a man emerged from the base of the jet stairs. He was in his late 50s, thin and wiry, with a severe face and pale, watchful eyes, behind rimless glasses. He wore a perfectly tailored grey suit. He was the human embodiment of the voice on the phone. "Miss Rossi?" He said, his voice just as clipped and impersonal as it had been on the call. "I am Harrison Finch. I am Mr. Sterling's Chief of Staff. Please come aboard." He led her up the stairs into the jet's cabin. If the car was a cocoon, this was a palace. Cream-colored leather seats, polished mahogany tables, fresh flowers in a crystal vase. It was larger and more luxurious than her entire apartment. A flight attendant with a placid smile offered her a drink. Isabella asked for water, her throat suddenly parched. They were the only two passengers. Finch sat opposite her, opening a leather-bound portfolio. He didn't engage in small talk. He began an interrogation disguised as a conversation. "You are a graduate student at Columbia University," he stated, not asked. "Art history. Your dissertation, Subtext and Subversion in the Fête Galante of Jean-Antoine Watteau, is 2 years overdue." Isabella's blood ran cold. How did you know that? "We believe in due diligence, Miss Rossi," Finch said, his eyes never leaving her face. "Your student loan debt currently stands at $142,000. Your mother, Catherine Rossi, resides in Cleveland and is awaiting coronary bypass surgery, which your family's insurance has deemed only partially covered." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, stripping her bare, laying out the architecture of her desperation for him to inspect. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was an audit. She felt a surge of anger, a defensive pride. "My personal life is none of your concern," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. Finch raised a thin eyebrow, a flicker of something, perhaps respect, in his cold eyes. "On the contrary, Mr. Sterling is making a significant investment by flying you halfway across the world. He needs to understand the nature of the asset. Your motivations are paramount. Are you motivated by desperation, by greed, or by a genuine desire for the opportunity being presented?" "And what opportunity is that?" Isabella shot back. "No one has bothered to tell me." "Mr. Sterling will explain that himself," Finch said smoothly, closing the portfolio. "My job is to ascertain whether you are a sound investment or a potential liability. Your interaction with Mrs. Dubois showed compassion and resourcefulness. Your academic background is intriguing, but people can be full of surprises." The rest of the flight passed in a tense, humming silence. Isabella stared out of the window, watching the Atlantic Ocean unfurl below them like a vast blue map to an unknown world. The luxury surrounding her felt like a gilded cage, beautiful and suffocating. She was an asset, a liability, a thing to be assessed. Chloe's words echoed in her mind. Their propositions can have clauses you don't see until it's too late. After 8 hours, they began their descent. The landscape that emerged from the clouds was one of breathtaking storybook beauty, snow-capped mountains, ringing a vast, impossibly blue lake. Geneva. They landed as smoothly as they had taken off. Another black car was waiting on the tarmac. The drive was short, winding up into the hills overlooking the city. They passed through a set of imposing iron gates and drove down a long gravel driveway lined with ancient cypress trees. The house, it was a flagrant understatement to call it a house, was a modern masterpiece of glass and stone built into the hillside with panoramic views of Lake Geneva and the distant Mont Blanc. It was magnificent, austere, and as silent and imposing as the man who owned it. Finch led her inside. The interior was cavernous with soaring ceilings and walls of glass. The furnishings were minimalist, expensive, and impersonal. It felt less like a home and more like a private museum. A museum curated by a ghost. He showed her to a guest suite that was larger than 3 of her apartments combined. It had its own balcony overlooking the lake. It was a room designed to impress, to awe, to intimidate. "Please refresh yourself, Miss Rossi," Finch said from the doorway. "Mr. Sterling will see you in his study in 1 hour." He closed the door, leaving her alone in the silent, opulent space. Isabella walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the view. The beauty was staggering, unreal. But she felt no joy, only a profound and terrifying sense of isolation. She was a world away from everything she knew, a pawn in a game whose rules she didn't understand, about to meet the king. The guest suite was a symphony of quiet luxury, a space so perfectly arranged it felt uninhabited. The king-sized bed was draped in linens with a thread count. She couldn't begin to guess the air was scented with a faint, unidentifiable fragrance of white tea and cedar. And the ensuite bathroom was a cavern of Italian marble and gleaming chrome fixtures. On a small desk by the window, a brand-new laptop and a smartphone sat in their boxes, silent offerings to her new temporary reality. For a few moments, Isabella allowed herself to be seduced by the sheer opulence of it all. She ran her hand over the cool, smooth surface of a marble countertop and touched the impossibly soft cashmere throw on a chaise lounge. This was a world she had only read about in novels and studied in paintings, a world of effortless astronomical wealth. But the initial awe quickly curdled into a disquieting awareness of her own displacement. She was an anomaly here, a scuffed-up paperback in a library of leather-bound first editions. Her simple navy suit, which had felt so professional and empowering back in New York, now seemed woefully inadequate. She showered in a stall larger than her kitchen, the water pressure a decadent luxury. As she dressed, she caught her reflection in the vast, polished mirror. The same Isabella with the same worried eyes stared back. The marble and chrome didn't change the fact that she was a stranger here, a curiosity brought in for inspection. The suite wasn't a haven. It was a holding cell, albeit a breathtakingly beautiful one. Harrison Finch's words echoed in her mind the nature of the asset. She wasn't a guest. She was a commodity being evaluated. With a deep breath, she steeled herself. She hadn't come this far to be intimidated by expensive furniture. She had come for answers. She had come because this impossible, terrifying path was the only one that didn't lead directly back to the suffocating despair of her old life. Exactly 1 hour later, she found her way through the silent, echoing hallways to the study. The door was a single towering slab of dark walnut. She knocked her knuckles, making a sound that seemed too loud in the profound quiet. The door swung open silently. Harrison Finch stood there, his expression as unreadable as ever. He simply nodded and stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Donovan Sterling was not sitting behind the massive, futuristic desk that dominated the room. He was standing by a wall of glass that offered a staggering panoramic view of the lake and the mountains beyond. The setting sun painted the snow on the peaks in hues of orange and pink. He was dressed simply in dark trousers and a grey cashmere sweater, and he held a small, delicate-looking teacup in his hands. He turned as she entered, and for the first time, she saw him clearly away from the theatrical gloom of the gilded sparrow. The sadness she had glimpsed in his eyes at the restaurant was not a fleeting expression. It was the room's primary resident. It clung to him like a shadow, softening the sharp, powerful lines of his face. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a poet in mourning. "Miss Rossi, Isabella, thank you for coming," he said. His voice was deeper than she expected, and quieter with a slight rasp. It was a voice accustomed to being listened to without having to be raised. "Please sit." He gestured to one of 2 leather armchairs positioned in front of the window away from the desk. It was a deliberate choice, She realized to make this a conversation, not an interview. He sat in the other chair, placing his teacup on a small table between them. Finch remained standing by the door, a silent grey sentinel. "I imagine you have a great many questions," Sterling began, his gaze fixed on the view, as if he found it difficult to make direct eye contact. "That would be an understatement," Isabella replied, her voice steady. He gave a small, sad smile. "Finch can be thorough. His methods lack a certain finesse, but his purpose is to protect me. Often from myself." He finally turned his gaze to her, and his eyes were piercingly direct. "I owe you an explanation, and an apology for the clandestine nature of my invitation." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The other night at the restaurant you showed great kindness to Mrs. Dubois. But it was not just the kindness that caught my attention. It was the language, the specific dialect you used, the gentleness of your accent. It was my wife's accent." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unexpected. Suddenly the pieces clicked into a different configuration. This wasn't about a business need for a translator. This was personal. Deeply personal. "My wife, Helene," he continued, his voice growing softer, "was from Paris. She was the most vibrant, fiercely intelligent person I have ever known. She saw the world through a different lens, a lens of art, of history, of beauty. Things I understood as assets on a balance sheet, she understood as pieces of the human soul." He took a sip of his tea, his hand not quite steady. "Since she passed, I have endeavored to continue her passions, to honor her memory. She was a great collector of art, specifically 18th century French art, the Rococo period, Fragonard, Watteau, Boucher. They were her friends, her confidants across the centuries." Isabella's heart began to beat faster. Watteau, the subject of her stalled dissertation, the coincidence was too profound, too specific. Helene had been searching for a particular painting for years. Sterling said, his eyes now distant, lost in a memory. "It's called Le Jardin Secret, the Secret Garden. It's a small early work by Jean-Honoré Fragonard. It is not one of his more famous pieces. In fact, its existence has been debated by scholars for decades. Most believe it was lost during the French Revolution." He leaned forward, a new intensity in his expression. But Helene was convinced it was real. She found a reference to it in the private journal of a Parisian aristocrat from the 1790s. She tracked its rumored provenance through 2 world wars. She believed it was hidden away in a private collection, somewhere forgotten. Finding that painting became her quiet obsession. He looked directly at Isabella, and for the first time she understood. She was not here because she spoke French. That was merely the key that unlocked the door. She was here because of what she knew. 3 days ago, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I received a highly confidential communication. Le Jardin Secret has surfaced. It is being sold in a private invitation-only auction in 2 days' time here in Geneva. The sellers are the descendants of a reclusive banking family, and the secrecy surrounding the sale is absolute." He stood up and walked over to a large antique wooden cabinet. From a drawer he retrieved a folder and brought it back, placing it on the table in front of Isabella. This is everything Helene had gathered. Her notes, her research, the historical references. He opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of old letters auction records and a single faded black and white photograph of a painting. It depicted a lush, overgrown garden scene. A young woman in a flowing gown sat on a stone bench, reading a letter, a subtle, secretive smile on her lips. Even in the poor quality photo, the mastery of the light and the delicacy of the brushwork were evident. It was undeniably Fragonard. "I am going to acquire this painting," Miss Rossi Sterling said, his tone now imbued with an ironclad determination. It is the last conversation I can have with my wife. But the art world, especially at this level, is treacherous. It is filled with forgeries, inflated provenances, and bad faith. My people are experts in finance, in logistics, in security. They are not experts in the soul of an 18th century canvas. He finally laid his cards on the table. I need someone who can look at that painting and know if it's real. Someone who can analyze the provenance documents and spot any inconsistencies. Someone who understands Hélène's passion not as a hobby, but as a serious intellectual pursuit. Finch's research led him to your academic work, your encounter at the restaurant. It felt like a sign, a moment of serendipity I could not ignore. He looked at her, his billionaire's armor stripped away, revealing the grieving husband beneath. My proposition is this, Isabella. I want to hire you for the next 48 hours as my consultant. I need you to be my expert. My eyes. I need you to help me bring Hélène's painting home. The room was silent, save for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere. Isabella looked from the photograph of the painting to the immense, sorrowful weight in Donovan Sterling's eyes. This was the opportunity. Not a job as a translator or a personal assistant in some gilded cage. It was a chance to do the very thing she was born to do, to use the knowledge she had fought so hard to acquire for a purpose that was deeply, profoundly human. Her own problems, the debt, the rent, her mother's illness, seemed to fade into the background, eclipsed by the sheer, beautiful impossibility of the task before her. "Where do I begin?" she asked. A flicker of relief so profound it was almost imperceptible crossed Donovan Sterling's features. It was the look of a man who had extended his last shred of hope and had not been rejected. He gestured towards the folder on the table. "You begin here," he said. This was Hélène's life's work, in a way, her academic pursuit. Everything she found is in that folder, but the sellers have also provided their own documentation, the paintings, supposed provenance expert authentications, and high-resolution digital images. Mr. Finch will bring you to the library. You will have unrestricted access to my resources. Anything you need, books, academic journals, access to online archives, you have only to ask. Mr. Finch, who had remained as still as a statue by the door, stepped forward. His expression was unchanged. His pale eyes still held the same skeptical glint. If Sterling saw Isabella as a moment of serendipity, it was clear Finch still saw her as a high-risk variable, an unvetted amateur thrust into a multi-million-dollar game. "If you will follow me," Miss Rossi Finch said, his tone clipped and formal. Isabella stood her legs, feeling a little unsteady. She gave a respectful nod to Donovan Sterling. "Thank you, sir. I'll do my best." He simply nodded back, his gaze already drifting back to the mountains, to the memory of the woman who had loved them. Finch led her out of the study and down a long white hallway that felt more like a modern art gallery than a corridor. The walls were hung with enormous, striking contemporary paintings, a Rothko here, a de Kooning there. It was a collection of staggering value, yet it felt cold, impersonal, chosen for its investment potential rather than for love. It was Sterling's collection, not Hélène's. They arrived at a set of double doors made of the same dark walnut as the study. Finch opened them to reveal a room that made Isabella's breath catch in her throat. It was a 2-story library, a bibliophile's fantasy brought to life. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were crammed with thousands of books, accessible by a rolling ladder on a brass rail. A huge fireplace stood at one end, and comfortable leather armchairs were arranged around a large oak table in the center. The air smelled of old paper leather and wood smoke. This, she knew instantly, was Hélène's room. This was the heart of the house. On the central table, a state-of-the-art digital workstation was set up. A massive, high-resolution monitor displayed a crystal-clear image of Le Jardin Secret. Beside it were stacks of documents in archival binders. "This is the seller's file," Finch explained, gesturing to the binders. "It contains the full provenance, as they claim it from the original commission by the Vicomte de Lille in 1765 through its alleged acquisition by a Swiss banker during the Napoleonic Wars to the present day. It also includes pigment analysis, canvas aging reports, and an authentication letter from Professor Alistair Finch." Finch, Isabella asked, raising an eyebrow. "Any relation," my brother Finch replied without a hint of warmth. "He is the head of the art history department at Oxford. His opinion carries considerable weight." The unspoken message was clear. "My brother, a world-renowned expert, has already signed off on this. What could you, a broke graduate student, possibly find that he missed?" This wasn't just a consultation. It was a test, a trial by fire. She was being pitted against the established pedigreed expert. Finch continued his tour of the resources. "Mr. Sterling's library is extensive. You will find first editions of every major text on Rococo art. We also have a subscription to every academic database and auction house archive in the world. A chef is on staff and will bring you whatever you wish to eat or drink. You will not be disturbed. The auction is in 36 hours. He paused, his gaze sharp. "Mr. Sterling is an emotional man when it comes to his late wife. I am not. My role is to protect his interests. I trust your findings will be based on empirical evidence and not on a desire to please your new benefactor." The thinly veiled accusation stung, but Isabella didn't let it show. She met his gaze directly. "Mr. Finch, I am an academic. Empirical evidence is the only thing I trust." His lips thinned into what might have been a line of reluctant approval. He gave a curt nod. "Very well. I will leave you to it." He turned and left, closing the heavy doors behind him with a soft, definitive click. Isabella was alone in the magnificent library, the silence broken only by the hum of the computer. For a moment, the sheer scale of the task was paralyzing. The fate of a lost masterpiece, the fulfillment of a dead woman's dream, and the expenditure of what would surely be tens of millions of dollars rested on her shoulders. Her Isabella Rossi, who just 2 days ago was worried about making enough in tips to cover her electric bill. A wave of imposter syndrome washed over her so powerful it almost made her dizzy. She took a deep breath, walked over to the fireplace, and placed her hand on the cool marble of the mantelpiece. She thought of her mother, of the years of sacrifice. She thought of the countless nights she had spent alone in libraries. Just like this one, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning passion for this exact subject. This was not a world she had stumbled into by accident. This was the world she had been preparing for her entire life. She was not an imposter. She was an expert. With renewed purpose, she walked to the table and sat down. She pushed Helene's personal folder aside for a moment, deciding to start with the official documentation, just as Finch and his brother would have. For the first hour, she meticulously went through the seller's provenance. It was almost too perfect. Each owner was documented, each transfer of ownership accompanied by a letter or a bill of sale. The chain was unbroken clean. Professor Finch's authentication letter was thorough, citing the brushwork, the color palette, and the thematic elements as being perfectly consistent with Fragonard's early work. She then turned to the high-resolution images on the screen, zooming in until she could see the individual cracks in the paint, the ghost of the canvas weave beneath. The technical skill was undeniable. The play of light on the silk of the woman's dress, the soft, feathery texture of the leaves, it screamed Fragonard. It was beautiful, perfect. Too perfect. A small nagging doubt began to form in the back of her mind. She had spent years staring at Fragonard's work. His paintings were known for their life, their energy, their joie de vivre. But they were also known for their subtle imperfections, their quick, almost impatient brushstrokes in the background details. He was a master of capturing a fleeting moment, and sometimes that meant a less defined leaf or a hastily rendered shadow. The painting on the screen was flawless. Every leaf on every tree was rendered with the same meticulous detail. It was technically brilliant, but it lacked the spark, the breath of life she associated with the artist. It felt studied, like an incredibly skilled imitation. Dismissing it as a subjective feeling, she forced herself back to the documents. She decided to cross-reference the provenance with Hélène's own research. Hélène's notes were more chaotic, a collection of hunches, dead ends, and inspired leaps of logic. She had focused not on the painting itself, but on its first owner, the Vicomte de Lille. According to the official provenance, the Vicomte had commissioned the work in 1765, and it had remained in his family's possession until it was sold to the Swiss banker in 1794. But Hélène had found something else. A notation in the margin of one of the Vicomte's letters taken from the French National Archives. It mentioned that his prized Fragonard was damaged in a small fire at his chateau in the winter of 1788. He wrote of his despair that the work was marred by smoke and heat near the lower left quadrant. Isabella's blood turned to ice. She turned back to the high-resolution image on the monitor, her heart pounding. She zoomed in on the lower left quadrant of the painting. It was the area depicting the stone bench and the forest floor. It was pristine. There was no sign of smoke damage, no hint of restoration, no cracked paint from heat exposure. The craquelure, the fine pattern of cracking on the surface of older paintings, was uniform across the entire canvas. If it had been damaged by fire and restored in the 18th century, the chemical composition and aging of the restorer's paints would be different. There would be evidence, however faint. There was none. She sat back in her chair, her mind racing. There were two possibilities. Either Hélène's research was wrong, based on a forged letter or a misinterpretation, or the flawless multi-million-dollar painting on the screen, the one authenticated by the esteemed Professor Finch, was a fake. A brilliant, masterful, but ultimately worthless forgery. The thrill of discovery quickly gave way to a cold dread. Isabella knew she couldn't just announce the painting was a fake. She had to build an irrefutable case. Pitting herself against Harrison Finch's powerful brother required more than a hunch. It required an arsenal of facts. Working through the night, fueled by coffee and adrenaline, she transformed the library into a war room. She corroborated Hélène's notes about a fire at the original owner's chateau with official municipal records. She then unearthed a dusty German thesis about a school of forgers from the 1890s, led by a disgraced artist named Jean-Paul Vincent. He was a genius at mimicking Fragonard, but with a fatal flaw for a forger, a perfectionism that made his work technically brilliant but emotionally sterile. The thesis mentioned his secret signature, his private mark of authorship hidden in his works, a tiny, almost invisible spider's web. With trembling hands, Isabella returned to the high-resolution image. There, in the painting's darkest shadow, she found it. The web was her smoking gun. She assembled her findings into a clear, concise presentation and summoned Sterling and Finch. In the study, she calmly laid out the evidence piece by piece. She showed them the fire record, the history of the forger, and finally the magnified image of the spider's web. Finch's skepticism dissolved into stunned, pale-faced silence. He was beaten. Donovan Sterling listened, his hope visibly draining away, replaced by a somber resignation. "So it's a fake," he said, his voice heavy with the loss of this final connection to his wife. "No," Finch declared, "we withdraw from the auction." But Isabella saw a different path. "Don't withdraw," she urged, her voice alive with a new, audacious strategy. "Let them think we know nothing. We use this as leverage. We meet them privately, before the auction, show them our proof, and give them a choice, a devastating public scandal or a quiet private sale." She paused, letting the brilliant, ruthless gambit sink in. "We offer to buy the painting for its true value as a masterpiece of forgery, saving them and Professor Finch from ruin." Harrison Finch stared at her astonished. Donovan Sterling's grief was replaced by a flash of admiration and renewed energy. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice charged with purpose. "Prepare the car. It appears Miss Rossi and I have an auction to attend." The auction was held in the sterile, silent vault of a private Geneva bank. Before the bidding could begin, Finch secured a private meeting. In a small, tense room, Isabella stood before the sellers, the Von Hess siblings, and a smug Professor Finch. Wasting no time, Isabella presented her evidence on a tablet. She showed them the magnified image of the spider's web hidden in the painting's shadows. "This is the signature of the forger, Jean-Paul Vincent," she stated calmly, her voice echoing in the quiet room. She followed with Hélène's research on the 18th century fire that had damaged the original canvas, proving the painting they possessed could not be authentic. The siblings' arrogance evaporated, replaced by pale-faced horror. Professor Finch stared aghast as his reputation crumbled before his eyes. It was then that Harrison Finch delivered the ultimatum, his voice cold as steel. They had a choice: sell the painting to Mr. Sterling immediately for a fraction of its supposed value, a fair price for a Vincent forgery, or face a public scandal that would decimate their family's name and the professor's career. Trapped, they accepted the deal. The painting was theirs. Back at the lakeside estate, the victory was palpable. Harrison Finch, for the first time, looked at Isabella with unadulterated respect. "I was wrong about you, Miss Rossi," he admitted, shaking her hand. After Finch left, Sterling turned to her, his eyes filled not with grief, but with profound gratitude. "You did more than save me money," he said. "You protected Hélène's legacy." He then offered her more than just a consulting fee. He asked her to become the director and chief curator of the new Hélène Sterling Art Foundation. She would have a limitless budget-full funding to complete her doctorate and the mission to build a collection that truly honored his wife's memory. Tears streamed down Isabella's face as she looked at the man who had seen her worth in a crowded restaurant. It was a future she had never dared to dream of. "Yes," she whispered. "I would be honored." The next day the painting hung in Hélène's library. It was not the lost original, but it was the end of a journey, a beautiful lie that had led Isabella to her profound, undeniable truth. And so a story that began with a whispered word of French in a bustling New York restaurant found its ending in the quiet, sunlit library of a Swiss estate. Isabella's journey reminds us that the most valuable things we possess are often not the skills the world immediately rewards, but the passions we cultivate in silence. Her expertise in art history, once a source of debt and despair, became her greatest asset. Her kindness offered freely, without expectation of reward, opened a door to a universe she never knew existed. This story is a testament to the idea that destiny isn't always a grand pre-written plan. Sometimes it's a quiet stranger at the next table waiting, listening, and recognizing a value in you that you may have forgotten you even had. What hidden skills do you possess? If you enjoyed Isabella's incredible story, please give this video a like share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own worth, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of unbelievable twists of fate.